the world's #1 podcasting platform for African stories. Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today on Africa Podcast Day. We're really excited to have you here. And on this panel, talking about education and media in podcasting in Africa, I am really excited to be joined by Kim Fox, founder of Cairo Podfest, Tony Doe, the man behind the podcast related newsletter, as well as very many podcasts and radio. And there's a lot of things we can say about Tony. And then we have Rutendo, who is the brains and the founder behind Podcast Sessions, a magazine on podcasting in Africa. Thank you guys so much for making the time and welcome. Hi, guys.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I want to start by
Thanks for having us.
Perfect. I want to start by asking you to introduce yourselves, because I feel like it's important. What I think is important about you might not be what it is you think is important about you. So I'm going to start with Kim, and then Tony, and then Rutendo. So Kim.
Yeah, I'm an educator first and foremost. That's my primary job, my primary source of income as a college professor at the American University in Cairo. I've been in Cairo for, I think, 14 years, which is longer than I've had any other job in my life. I worked a lot of years in radio in the US, but in radio in the US, you end up jumping around. I also founded Podfest Cairo. We're working on our 4th edition, which will take place on March 4th. So that's coming down the pipeline. We're about a month out. And I also have a podcast, an award-winning podcast called the Ekia Master Podcast, Tell Your Story Egypt. It's a narrative, nonfiction, bilingual podcast about living in Cairo. So that's the brief. I have some other titles, of some podcast-related organizations, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Cool, thank you. Tony, tell us a bit about yourself.
What can I say? My name's Tony Doe. I'm based in Lagos, Nigeria. I have a newsletter known as Podcast Related this week in the Podverse. I publish new editions every Friday, and every other Tuesday I get to feature one or two Nigerian or African podcasters sharing or willing to share their stories with the rest of the world. I'm also country rep for Nigeria for the Association of Podcast and Voiceover Artists. And we had our first Podcast Voice Awards last year, and Dr. Kim's podcast was one of the winners. Yeah, I like to think of myself as a podcast evangelist. I have a background in radio, and I love the world of audio. And there's nothing greater than coming from the continent of ultimate storytellers, which is Africa itself. I mean, this is the home of the original griots. So it just gives me pleasure to know that there's a medium that can continue to evolve the way or the ways we tell our stories. And I just want to play my part in that and evangelize. Thank you.
Yes, I love that. A podcast evangelist. I've never heard that before. I'm stealing that from today.
Oh, I do that a lot.
Tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Rutendo Nyamuda. I am a podcaster, but a media specialist by profession. So I've been in the media space for over 10 years now. I think the whole big thing for me when it comes to podcasting is my background, which is the art of storytelling. So from the magazine and news sector and how it's progressed to like television and then became audio is essentially storytelling just in different forms. So I'm really, really passionate about, people's stories, how they got to where they are, etc. Love those journeys. And then I started the podcast sessions, I'd say probably like 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago now. In the midst of the pandemic, everyone found their calling or found their niche or found a passion in the pandemic. And mine just happened to be starting a magazine called the Podcast Sessions. And last year we launched the news website element of it. So it was supposed to be a podcast, but then the podcast kind of fell by the wayside. So it's there, but our obviously shining star is the magazine and now the news website. But we are hoping to bring back the podcast again this year. Yeah, and I'm just super passionate about the podcasting space as well as the other two incredible guests are. And it's just been really inspiring to see how it's been growing and all the new podcasts that have, come onto the audio space in the last few years.
Amazing. Thank you, guys. It's really interesting for me. And the reason I wanted you all here is because you all have a background in media, but you're all very passionate and involved in the podcasting industry as well. So I wanted to talk to you about education and media in podcasting, specifically on the continent. And the first question I wanted to ask is, what does education in podcasting look like for you as individuals? When you hear education in podcasting, what does that mean to you?
I guess I'll take the lead on that since that's what I do. I teach future media practitioners to join the field. So we're talking about doing that storytelling that Rutendo mentioned, trying to make sure they understand that craft. Often when students are taking my courses, this is the first time they're being introduced to narrative nonfiction pieces, features, documentaries that are sound specific. So again, that's the teaching process, to try to expose audiences to that form of media and storytelling. And that, as Tony said, we're the original griots, here in Africa, and to amplify the stories from this culture. I think that's very important. And so that education is often rooted in the home, in that oral tradition of storytelling. And what we're doing is taking that mass media and we're amplifying it. And so that is an informal part of the education. And then I also do that formal part as well.
Amazing. Rutendo?
Oh, yeah, I'll jump in next. Kim, I am incredibly fascinated by the work that you do. I must just say that. It's absolutely incredible. I think that, with any new medium and new form, especially in media for something that is so new, there is no historical education for podcasting. And so what you find is there's this mix of almost like, this is what maybe the traditional sense of podcasting looks like, but now people are redefining it for themselves. So it's almost like, how do you have the foundation with the redefinition of it, and how do you take it and make it your own? But yes, you kind of do need some sort of base or a framework or a box to work within, and people have just taken that and run with it. From the podcast sessions, I'd say like our big thing around education isn't necessarily founded upon the, how do you record a podcast episode or the technical stuff, although we do share stuff every now and again. Our heart on the education side is almost amplifying the voices of African podcasters in the space. So our educational aspect or element is trying to showcase who is in the industry, what they're doing, and providing that platform for them to shine so that other people can learn through them. So it's almost a different approach to, it's more of the news side of it. Let me put it that way. It's education via news within the industry.
Amazing. Tony?
Well, for me, what I'm doing with the newsletter is sort of educating from the community perspective. It's a lot of curation from other established podcast news, but the emphasis is on how, as a community, podcasters help each other out. So it's about the culture itself, amplifying it, and then trying to help people find their own tribes or their own small communities within the established communities. So you have diverse stories, but you have individuals who tap into these diverse stories and can help, or rather can find lessons in them to build their own communities. So it's about the communities, what individuals are doing, what terms are familiar, what the networks look like, what tools are available, what tips can be useful to the African creative. And I find a way to bring all those together and share them weekly on the platform. Before then, when I used to sort of teach or facilitate a broadcast class, which I still do, but it's a little limited now, my emphasis at the time was on helping individuals who were trying to break into radio have a base to express themselves. And so rather than waiting for auditions or 30-second auditions or one minute auditions, you need to send into radio stations. You could actually create your own shows, amplify your shows, and then if people come asking, or if you have to attend an audition, you could actually just slip it in that you have an existing podcast, and then they could listen to what you've been doing on your own and see if that fits into what they're trying to do on the radio station as well. So there are so many, it's changed over the years. That was what it was like in 2017. But now you're finding more people who just want to tell their own stories and not get locked into a format. And then they need all the help they can get. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Amazing. And you brought up something interesting that Kim had also mentioned, and Rutendo, based on your background, that the media that you have studied or been in, Tony for radio, I know Kim was in radio as well, bringing that into podcasting helps. So I just wanted to know, do you feel like there's a connection that we can run between media, traditional media, so specifically radio in Africa, and podcasting? Is there a line we can draw for people? Because like Kim mentioned, a lot of people don't understand what podcasting is. When you're introducing podcasting, it's the first time they've heard about the concept. So what's the line we can draw then from the traditional media that is understood to podcasting?
How do I put this? Most radio stations are basically brick and mortar structures. But with a podcast, you're strictly digital. You could be in your bedroom and nobody knows you're in there, but you can be heard all over the world and people will believe your story if it's authentic enough. So it's and then you're not restricted by the very things that restrict radio, such as time and transience. You know, with radio, if it's on now and you miss it, you've missed it. But with a podcast, people always have the option of going to check out what you did again. Now, even that element is coming back to sort of bite radio in the bum, in the sense that the way we consume audio or media in general has changed. There were times I would look forward when I was younger, and when the options were fewer, I would look forward to a certain radio show at a particular time. So it means I would have to reorganize my schedule to ensure I don't miss that show, or else it's gone. But it's changing now. Radio stations have the options of actually going ahead with their content, and then within the content, notifying that what you just heard could be available again for you on the podcast platform. So there's a relationship, but there's still a structural difference. With radio, you bring a lot of elements, including transmitters and high-powered equipment, and then different departments and bosses and meetings and all that, with some big tools and the rest of the world. So yeah, that's clearly what it is. And then of course you don't have a digital, or you don't have a frequency modulation or an amplitude multiplier to, you're not on a station. It's the name of the podcast, and then you search for it. You're not, running through radio dials to find content. You're actually just searching on the internet, and then you find what you're looking for.
Right. That makes absolute sense. Ladies?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in if you don't mind. And I'll make it quick as well. And I love the way you frame that, Tony. It's great to make sure those distinctions are there and that people understand, what is a podcast and how is it different than traditional radio. But those common denominators come in us, the delivery system, the people. Like if you're on the radio, you can have a podcast, your ability to speak and to be a host or to be a producer. And so I also wanted to mention the careers. If you're a producer, who are you producing? You can be a radio producer or a podcast producer. And often those roles are the same. There are some distinctions depending on what podcast or what project you're working on, obviously. And then there's the equipment. As Tony mentioned, you could be in a studio or you might not be. What kind of equipment are you using? You're using a microphone. Maybe you're using your phone. So there are some common denominators for what are podcasts and how we're producing that audio content.
Yeah, and just to add on to that as well, I think the foundations and fundamentals of media itself are actually quite similar. So one can actually move between different mediums. So as myself, I started off as a journalist, moved into the PR space, moved into TV, back into PR. video production, corporate video production, and then podcasting. And the reason why I can produce podcasts, I mean, I might not be the best sound engineer or the best social media manager or anything, but what I can do is produce, because the foundations and the fundamentals of production, of storytelling, are the same. Can you research? Can you write? Can you put a story together? How does the story come to life? If someone else has edited, can you listen to it and go, oh my goodness, why did we add that? Or why is that not there? Or should it be there? And then you go into different forms of podcasting, right? Even into documentary style podcasting, which is like such a phenomenal medium. That style of podcasting, it's not good enough to just hit record and sit back and go, we've created a documentary podcast. There's so many layers and so many elements. There's the news understanding of that, like some really good news journalists who've become incredible podcasters. So it's also finding out your talent and almost maximizing that within the podcast space. You could be an incredible orator who has no sound engineering background, and you get someone to record and edit, but people are like, goodness, have you heard that person's voice? Or you could be the most incredible sound engineer who can edit white noise basically, and be like, this is such a beautiful sounding podcast, but you don't know what went behind the scenes. So it's also just finding just being in the media space, finding your niche or element that you're really good at, and having that almost be your segue into podcasting. Because for me, everything I've learned about editing, I have no editing background or anything, has been learned by doing. So you enter and then you explore other elements, whether it's social media or, again, sound, or figuring out the tech stuff, which is pretty interesting.
That's amazing. You say something that I always tell podcasters, because everyone has this ideal in their head where they think, when I get to this point, I'll be able to start. But sometimes until you start, there are things you'll never learn. So I'm always just like, start now. Just start with your phone, start with whatever it is you have, and then grow and learn from it, because you might have the perfect equipment and every perfect editor and everything, you'd still be learning as you go. So you might as well just start with what you have. Each of you has an amazing platform. So podcast related, podcast sessions, and Podfest Cairo. And I wanted to know, what roles do you feel like the platforms you've created play in educating not only Africans, but the world on podcasting in Africa? I know that sounds like a very big question, but in the thought process, did it feel like, I'm doing this for the continent? What is it that pushed you? And do you feel like it plays a role in education?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think what's quite interesting or fascinating from an education perspective with anything that you do is it almost starts with something that's exciting and something that you do for self. And I think what all of our platforms have done, and even any podcaster who just shares their podcast with the world, is you take it from that, like, it's just me and my niche, to something bigger. And into your community, and then into the region, and then onto the continent. And then naturally, because podcasting is that digital medium, someone overseas is going to pick it up and be like, oh my goodness. I know for us with the podcast sessions, we had never, and I still don't think we've actually ever advertised or spent any money in international spaces. But what was quite interesting was our natural organic reach, even from our readership perspective, came from the US, some from Europe, and then obviously the African continent, where we're pumping. And for us, it's always been like, and please don't shun me if your country isn't mentioned, but it's always been like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa were our focal points for a number of reasons. And so it was always very interesting for us looking at our readership numbers, looking at our sometimes to our even listenership numbers, and then like finding out like, why are people overseas actually listening to us? And then realizing, I'm so happy they're listening to this, because you're amplifying African stories. What we've really enjoyed from the podcast sessions perspective, because even for our covers, we've had, of all our covers, we've only had one non-podcaster on the cover, and then like one inspired microphone podcast cover. But every cover has been an African in the podcast scene who is doing something unique, or is in a specific role, or is pioneering in the space that they're in. And so we appreciate and do not take it for granted at all that this is not just a magazine. You know how they say act local, think global? I think that's what we've done, is we've created a platform and a magazine for Africans by Africans, but on a global level that even international people can look at it and go, oh, this is actually really interesting. Well, there's a podcast magazine, and who is this? And from that perspective, be a little bit more engaging. So it's been a very interesting and exciting journey. But like I said, with us, our education is more of, who are the movers and the shakers in the space, and making sure that we give them that platform to shine at the end of the day.
That is very important. Kim?
Yeah, we have something similar going on with Podfest Cairo and the Ekia Master podcast. We're just trying to make sure that people know what's going on in Egypt. And people always ask me, like, hey, what's the podcast scene like there? So this is one way to get that knowledge out. In terms of attendees, for example, at Podfest Cairo, I mean, they're coming for the knowledge, but they're also coming for community. Like a lot of us, like who else is doing something and we can collaborate, or they can share a technique with me. So that kind of knowledge sharing is also an important part of being in a conference space. Or if it's talking about the Ekia Master podcast, again, people want to know what it's like to live in Cairo, like what's going on, what makes Cairo different or the same, and something that's unique about it. And so those kinds of stories and sharing those experiences are also important for us when we're working on those two different projects.
Amazing. Tony?
Okay, I was waiting for the mic to turn on. Similar to what the ladies have talked about, it's about amplifying, it's about evangelizing. I have favorite segments in the newsletter that I always look forward to, and sometimes those are the segments I fill in first before the major news stories. I like the tips and tools segments of my newsletter. I find that that's where most of the questions come in from. The inspiration for the newsletter really were questions I've been asked by people in my own community, and then by individuals wanting to come into the podcast space. So having a place to find what's happening in the podcast space that has to do with tools and has to do with resources, and how individual successful podcasters are succeeding at what you're doing and willing to share that knowledge. It gives me joy to be able to put it in the newsletter and then amplify that message as well. Now, interestingly, I thought I was doing it just for the Nigerian audience, but I found that Just As Podcast Sessions is enjoying most of the people who read the newsletter are in the US. So I guess a lot of the SEO skills that we apply sort of catches their attention first and then comes home. But there's something new I'm trying to do again. I've started curating playlists on Spotify. I think that's one of the reasons I'm kind of stuck with Spotify for a bit. I can actually curate playlists that I can update regularly. And that's another way I'm helping the local podcasters get mileage. And it's interesting to see that people who've asked me what kind of Nigerian podcasts exist look forward to those playlist suggestions that end up in the newsletter on Fridays. And that's another way to tell people that, well, there is local content. These are the local storytellers. You can have conversations with them and you can also enjoy their shows.
That is a very amazing way to use what we have available to us, like with Spotify and being able to create playlists. I think it's very interesting because in a lot of people's minds, playlists are for music. So the fact that we can use it in podcasting is mind-blowing. So I'm glad that you're doing that for the people. All three of you have talked about community and collaboration. Finding your community, creating community with what you're doing, how important collaboration is. Do you think media can play a role in building the communities and creating them? Traditional media and podcasts, how do we play a role in creating the communities around podcasting?
Do I go in? I think it's about value positioning. Yeah, I think it's about value positioning from my perspective. podcasters need to let a lot more people know what they're doing. And one of the ways to do that is to leverage on what already exists with available media. Even with newspapers and TV and radio, we have opportunities to sneak into the advert space and get heard on these other platforms, which will help amplify what we're doing. Earlier today, I was at a radio station talking about podcasting, and I think I had 2 converts almost immediately. And these were people who had all their lives probably thought radio was like the biggest thing they would ever do. And they're looking at me and they're like, okay, look, we have ideas and we want to broaden. And I'm telling them that you actually have a powerful platform that could help you expand those ideas. You even have access to your own ad rates. So if you decide you're going to do your own podcast, you could start first by amplifying on the platform you're on and letting people know you have a podcast that exists. So there's a symbiotic relationship that exists between some major media houses and podcast platforms. And I only see that increasing over time. Like what we're doing with AfriPods already, where we're getting radio stations to get their best bits of content and convert them into podcast versions. It's exciting. And I'll tell you this, here in Lagos, for instance, where the stations I've spoken to, it's affected even how they go about their programming. Now, whatever they were doing before and, believing that was sufficient for them, it's changing because now they're looking at it from a marketing perspective. They're looking at it from a longevity perspective. They're redefining a lot of their content so that nothing becomes stagnant anymore. Whatever they're creating has to be something that can last forever, people can refer to again. And so you're seeing more people doing research, you're seeing more people do in-depth work, you're seeing more people get more original with what they want to talk about, with their content. So in an interesting way, podcasting is actually nudging radio in the right direction. If radio had been stagnant for a while, it's looking for different ways to evolve itself. It will always be here. It will never go away, but it sees itself now as something that can be more than it was. And it can do this by partnering with its cousin, podcast.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cousin or brother?
Yes.
Kim?
No, I mean, he's on to something and he knows it and he's probably been onto it for a while, but people who don't know the space don't really know how to capitalize on it. That cross promotion is huge. So for example, to build on what Tony was saying, if you have a morning show that's popular, but again, it's traditional radio. If you don't catch it in real time, you miss it. Playing those clips on a podcast, especially if it's like something that they do every day at 9 o'clock. It's like you can just take that 2, 3, 5 minute bit, bring it on and put it in its own feed. And so that could be another revenue stream as well. So yeah,
Yes.
the other thing I think about with radio that I haven't seen or I hadn't seen a lot of radio stations building on was their access and use of the studio. I just felt like, yeah, you can rent that out. That's again another revenue stream. Like, come on, jump on this. And you could also pay a podcaster. You could pay a podcaster a lesser salary to go in and do their podcast in that studio. And the cost to you is so nominal because you're going to end up monetizing that content. It's just like radio hasn't, to me, fully capitalized on what they have. Now, for the podcasters, the same thing is in play. How do you get that cross promote for your show on that radio station? How do you get to expand your audience, especially if you're doing something that the radio station knows everyone's listening to your podcast? So they're going to want to say, hey, let's talk about you so we can amplify this thing, because if we're associated with you, we're a part of your success as well. So there's a lot of that marketing part of it. Like, how do we take these clips? How do we get them on blogs and social media? How do we use those free platforms to then build up for both parties, both radio and podcast?
And what I'd add is, at the end of the day, for like media platforms, even looking at it from both perspectives, media platforms, radio shows, newspapers, and I've seen a lot of news houses going into podcasting, you've got nothing to lose.
Oh, they
You've
are.
got the staff. You've got the staff on hand. You just say we're increasing your KPIs, and now you're joining the podcast crew. You probably have in-house editors. You've got an in-house social media team. For them, they need to be smart about maximizing and paying their people more, but maximizing talent. But you got to increase the salary as well. You can't just give them more work and no increased salary. That for them is the opportunity that they should take hold of. And then on the other side, from a podcaster's perspective, you've always got to think about, and it's because I come from a news perspective, a news background, you've got to ask, why is your content important, right? It doesn't matter whether you are podcasting about like paint or weather patterns, or if you're podcasting about fashion or business and news. You've always got to ask the question when you're approaching media for stuff, why is this important to them and their audience? Radio stations is one thing. Yeah, cool. Maybe they can play your clips, etc., etc. But why don't you go to a online digital media platform and say, can I tell you about 5 tips that came out of my episode today? Right? 9 times out of 10, they'll be like, oh, that's really good. 5 tips and tricks. And if you want to listen to the full episode, go to my fashion podcast, right? Or you go to a magazine and you say, look, I've got this health and wellness podcast. Why don't you do a profile on me? I have this podcast. It's absolutely amazing. And we've actually interviewed these people on the platform. And then if you really, really want to like garner some celebrity traction, find someone really famous and really amazing and say, hey, I've got this podcast. I think you'd be phenomenal. And then amplify their voices. So you've got to be thinking as a podcaster, what is newsworthy about this episode? It doesn't matter what it is, just what is newsworthy and what can people get an added value for it. Sometimes it's great to put on your show notes and et cetera, but you want to keep doing what you're doing, but you want to maximize the audience that you're speaking to.
Yeah, you can also repurpose this content that we're sharing. So there's a thought, right?
Right. Very true. So if you're listening and watching, the group here, send it to them. They have the platforms to amplify you.
So it's an entire masterclass.
It is a masterclass. I was just about to ask the question as Rutendo went into it, but because we've focused a lot on like media personalities, and we've seen that happen where it's media personalities who adopt podcasting and they already have the audience. So what then happens for me who doesn't have necessarily the background or the fame that comes with already having been on radio or television and trying to approach people? And I was just about to ask the question, and Rutendo was just like, just walk up to the magazine. And I was like, okay, she read my mind.
But even to add on to that, I think some people just because you're a celebrity and a well-known person doesn't mean your podcast is going to be successful. And just because you're someone who has no voice doesn't mean it's not going to be successful. Some of the podcasters I now call celebrity podcasters or famous influential podcasters, I knew nothing about them before they started their podcast. And actually with some of them, because of their podcast, their voices have been amplified. So it's not a set in stone. This is the step to success.
You're right. You're very right about that for sure, because it's been shown where some people had like the first episode out of the hype, got listened to, and after that you can't retain the audience. So you shouldn't worry about your positioning, of course. If there was one thing you could teach people about the African podcasting industry, so I know you're talking about creators. Each of you have like a platform for creators. You have a platform for everyone in the ecosystem. You're teaching. But if there's one thing, you have one thing you can tell people about the African podcasting ecosystem, what would it be? Tony, you want to start?
Okay, it's a treasure trove. We have lots of diamond here, and it's a treasure trove really of content, of storytellers, and I think we need to appreciate what it is we do, even if nobody has noticed it yet. And that's why I'm happy that we have platforms on the continent, present on ground, who are doing their bit to ensure that, you know, we keep amplifying this before other people start coming in. The continent is a treasure trove. Economically, it might not look like what some people would expect. I'm not particularly happy about how they attach the dollars to the podcasting industry, every discussion, because there's a lot more that goes on with podcasting than just turning in revenue for blue chip companies or major brands. There are stories here that should have been in classrooms as part of the curriculum and didn't make it there, but there are people who want to tell these stories. There's a lot of history that has been handed down to us from skewed media perspectives, that now the truth has an opportunity to break out of the shadows and be told, and then nobody can gatekeep that. There's so much that can be done in the audio space with podcasting now, and it's only going to get better. As I said, it's a treasure trove. If you're looking for authentic storytellers who are ready to share with you everything that's happening to them on the continent presently, and that had happened in the past that would still be relevant to what's happening to us in the present, and this is exactly where you should be looking.
Yeah, I feel like we are the disruptors, like hands down. People in Africa don't often have the same resources that people do in Western parts of the world. And so we're bringing a uniqueness to the table from the gate, like in our ability to do this without those high-end resources, the ability to say, you listen to traditional radio, again, a podcast doesn't have to be the same format as traditional radio. We don't have to do things at the top of the hour and do the news at the bottom of the hour. Like, yeah, here's your chance to just disrupt it all and have your own voice and make your stamp on this field. And that's what I feel like African podcasters are bringing to the table.
Yes, Rutendo.
I would definitely say it's bigger than you think. Oftentimes we sit in like our communities and we know our community-based podcast or the people we speak to, etc. And I'd say that for both from a Pan-African perspective and an international perspective, this industry is bigger than you actually think it is. It's overwhelming when you start digging into it and you can feel like, oh my goodness, like where is this coming from? And I almost want to tie that within almost like this idea of this point of inflection, is I feel like there's a lot of stuff that's been happening, bubbling under the scenes for the last couple of years, and more happens every year. 1 year we didn't have an awards. Last year we had awards. We are having more and more newsletters. We have more and more, I'm sure there'll be more magazines popping up soon. There, the likes of Tony curating these Spotify playlists, Kim is educating the next generation of podcasters. So there's so much that is happening, bubbling under the scene. And it's almost like we're waiting for this point of inflection where it's just going to be like massive. And people are going to be like, oh my word, the African podcast scene, overnight success. No, it's bigger than you think. It's definitely bigger than you think.
It is.
I feel like it is for sure bigger, but I love the words that you've used, being treasure trove, disruptors, and bigger than you think, because it's very true. At AfriPods, we normally have like monthly meets in different countries. And every time you'll have people meeting and they're just like, wait, I didn't know we had this many podcasters in my country. I've been doing it for this long. So it's even in being in the industry, still not understanding how big it is. So we're here to tell you it's not overnight. There'll be at least some evidence that at least we'll have seen how many playlists Tony made, so African, like, it's not really overnight. We've been working at it for a while. So I wanted to ask you as the last question, right? What growth would you like to see in the African media industry on the way they cover podcasting? Because we're all media, we all have media backgrounds. I'm a media person as well. I'm a trained journalist. And I just wonder, because I feel like it's very important, we've all mentioned, that there's a role the media has to play, whether it's the magazines, the blogs, radio stations, there's opportunities for them as well. But what growth would you like to see in how they cover podcasting on the continent?
Just an investment in the field. I mean, I'll give an example of, at least from my perspective, and I haven't been in Egypt for a year. I just returned and we'll be starting back to classes tomorrow. But what I noticed before I was on sabbatical was that traditional media just doesn't have any respect for the platform, and they don't know how to use it. And so when I say traditional media, I'm like television stations, newspapers, and they're just kind of waiting for it to take off as opposed to experimenting with it. And even the local radio stations, they're not doing the things that we were just talking about. So what my wish list is to say, like, yes, here, someone has to walk them through and show them how lucrative it could be. Like, maybe that's the difference that they need to see. I would like to see them really see the value in what we have to offer.
Very true. Tony?
Yeah, everything Dr. Kim said, exactly all she said. And we will have to play a role in that too ourselves. And maybe that's why we need to keep amplifying. And now I'm going to have a look at my directory and look at all the names and emails of core media people I know personally, especially those who make executive decisions on their platforms, and bombard them with emails telling them that we exist and we have a right to be amplified on their platforms as well. I probably might have to show them some numbers too, but I will play my part by bothering them.
And we thank you, Rutendo.
It's kind of linked to what Kim said about almost the resources elements of it. It's almost every day on Twitter, I see a new grant opportunity or a new work opportunity or something that's new in the international podcast scene. And once a quarter, something happens in the African podcast space, but it's almost limited, or those who get selected for those opportunities are already well known. So you're not helping the ecosystem by highlighting those who are already at the top because you're like numbers and money and etc. I would want to see more opportunities almost reaching the middle tier podcasters who almost need the assistance to get to that next level. And once we're almost there or in a better position, and that could be corporate, that could be, like I said, grant opportunities. I mean, the amount that's happening, particularly in the US, and you go to the criteria and it's like, has to be in the US, and you're like, but cuts, So but that's the interesting thing, is still as Africans, it's not like we're waiting for these grants. We've already started, we're already doing the thing. We're just saying the support will amplify. It's not going to stop us from not continuing and pursuing. It could be that notch. Do you know what I mean? So just more companies and the opportunities, whether you're an Apple or a Spotify, both international brands and local brands, right? We're not always just looking to international for support. Where are international companies, our Pan-African companies also offering African support? We can't always just look to outside. We also just need to believe in ourselves and say, you know what, this year I'm going to offer and I speak this out to whichever company feels led, like $100 million US dollar / highest currency in the world opportunity of a grant, and it's going to go towards podcasters who actually aren't even in the thousands listener threshold, but they're doing something, and we can see that they're doing something.
Yeah, it's very true. They should invest in the people who are telling the stories. I want to thank you guys so much for making time today. I am going to now give you an opportunity to tell everyone where they can meet you. And if you have anything that we haven't covered that you want people to know about podcasting in Africa, this is your time. So, Kim, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I'll jump in. I'll just say, I think about educating because that's my core background, and in disrupting as well. And this isn't, I don't think, is a disruptor idea, but I think we also have to go back to, or we should start with, educating the young people. Like, if I have students coming into my classroom and they already know about audio and how to make it. And so I say that to say summer youth programs and teaching the youth to do this craft. What is it like when I have advanced students coming in, and then we can really jump in and go. So that's some of the disruptive things I want to start thinking about in how do we get our African youth to be involved in those kinds of programs to get them on the ground running. Two other initiatives that I didn't mention that are extremely rooted in education are the Broadcast Education Association. I'm currently the vice president for academic relations, coming up on being the president in just a couple of months. So my life is about to be disrupted in ways I've never dreamed of. But again,
congratulations.
Thank you. But with BEA, again, our core is we are educating the future practitioners. And my focus has always been on those radio and audio practitioners. And we do a conference annually. What we've noticed in our conference content is that almost all of our panels are on podcasting. So that's telling you like, where is the conversation going? The ideas that are coming in for panels and the content that people want are podcast related. The other organization that I am the co-president of is the Association for Independence in Radio. They're based in the US, but what I love about AIR is that we are the freelancers, the independents, and AIR is advocating for rates that are equivalent to what full-time staffers get paid. So we really do have a huge role. I'm trying to get them to expand their international scope. But again, they are doing a lot of online training in terms of that education space and also working with other organizations that have the opportunity to educate podcasters. So that's it. And thank you, of course. Yeah.
And where can we find you and the beautiful companies that you have told us about today?
I mean, I'm still sticking it out. I'm still on Twitter. Find me there. That's I know a lot of people have dumped it for whatever reason. I'm just like, yeah, I'm just going to stay there until the ship goes under.
You're the captain of the ship. So we will put the details for her Twitter in the description box below. Tony, would you like to go next?
Takes a while for the mic to unmute. Okay. You can find me through this single link, bio.link/TonyDoe. bio.link/TonyDoe. You'd see the links to my newsletter, podcast related, This Week in the Podverse. It's also available on Substack. Please subscribe. I'm on Twitter at TonyDoeVO and TonyDoe Media. I'm on LinkedIn, TonyDoeVO, and I'm on Facebook as well. I'm looking forward to WhatsApp having a podcast API, and then I'm leaving all these other platforms and sticking with the WhatsApp community.
Don't let them hear you, Tony. They might just do it. Did you have anything else you wanted to add? Is there a remark you wanted to add that we did not mention?
Okay. I don't know if you knew about this, but I was running this poll between 2018 and 2021, where I was assessing the podcast listening habits in Nigeria. And then by the time Africa Podfest came in partnership with Baraza Media, I decided, you know what, they have a bigger machinery. But I realized that it still helps if we have multiple platforms or individuals who can keep collating this into the Nigerian podcast space. And then I'm having to speak to individual podcasters to share digits and share numbers. Meanwhile, a lot of them don't have the analytics of what their listener base is like. So I started that again. And in the next 1 month, I hope to collate as many results as possible. And in the first week of April, God willing, I'll publish probably the most comprehensive podcast listening habits so far in Nigeria. So I'm working on that now.
Congratulations. And if you want to participate in the survey, Tony will share the link and we'll put it in the description box as well. Rutendo, over to you.
So as you guys know, the news and the media is my big passion. So I would say anyone who has anything that they do want to share and amplify, do not send us your podcast and say, please, can you write about our podcast? We want to make sure that we're also educating and sharing news with the African community. So I would say events that are happening in the space, let us know. Awards that you're winning both internationally and locally, let us know. When Podfest Cairo, springs up, we want to be pushing that content. Tony, when you come through with even your results and findings, that's the content we want to push out. And obviously, Tony, with you at AfriPods, anything you guys do, like that is the content we want to share. Our job and our role as the podcast sessions is to make sure this news shines. And for those who are thinking oh, how do we get onto media? You can start with us. Like, we're like, when they say grab the low-hanging fruit, we're the low-hanging fruit. So connect with us. You can follow us at the podcast sessions on various social media platforms. Check out the website. But most of all, just feel free to email us and share some thoughts and insights. Ultimately, I always say, our big dream is to be like the Pod News of Africa, but bigger. And that's where we really, really want to go. So if you want to amplify your voices, please, that's where we feel what our role is in the industry. So please do share with us. Other than that, thank you guys all so much.
And the grant, we're still asking for the grant, right?
That's you. All the monies. We'll disperse it. Just send it to us. We'll disperse it.
Okay. They heard it here first. Send the money to Rutendo and she'll send it. Thank you guys so much for making the time. Thank you for being here. We do not take it for granted that you did this with us. Happy Africa Podcast Day to everyone who is watching. And you can reach all of these people and follow them. Their details will be in the description box below. And when they start talking about the industry growing, this will be the history. When they tell you it happened in one day, send them to this video, right? Thank you guys so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.